Welcome to the Be Global by Design podcast, where we talk with creatives, designers, and change makers about developing communities and a global world we all want to live in. Today, we're talking to Loren Stoddard. We've known each other for about 25 years. We've worked more closely together over the past 7 years, first on trade shows, then on regular discussions about ESG, social impact, and ending the plight of child abuse and labor in our critical supply chains, both chocolate and minerals. Loren has worked in places most people would consider very difficult environments like Sudan, Iraq, Afghanistan, yet his first instinct tends to be there's a market somewhere, let's find it. He was known as the public-private bridge builder at USAID and has recently founded Veritacor. He also serves as a board member on Be Global by Design. Welcome, Loren. How are
Thank
you?
you. I'm excited to be here. Pleasure. It's a pleasure to join you.
Thanks for coming. So, we have talked at length about international development, corporate responsibilities, markets, trade shows, and more. I want to focus today's conversation because we could talk for hours, and we have, um, about supply chain management, especially in industries that tend to be exploitive. But they're also linked to a lot of creatives like chocolate. We like to eat chocolate, and there's a lot of creativity when it comes to creating different chocolate flavors and things like that. So let's start there. Tell me about your work on chocolate.
So chocolate's a funny thing because everyone knows about chocolate. Who doesn't like chocolate? It's one of the most popular products on the planet. Everybody loves chocolate and chocolate cake and chocolate ice cream. These are the favorite flavors of everyone around the world. And yet people also don't know about chocolate. What's sort of funny, it's kind of that weird conundrum because everyone knows chocolate. I mean, literally everyone knows about chocolate. And yet where cacao comes from, where the flavor comes from, how it's developed, I don't think anybody knows. It's sort of one of those great mysteries of our modern world. And so it's kind of this interesting conundrum or oxymoron to me that people enjoy these fantastic products.
Mm-hmm.
They're enjoying their lives. They're just going about doing whatever they're doing.
Yeah.
And yet they have no idea where these things come from and what impact their consumption of these things has on people around the world. This is sort of, it's the great thing about, I just say about the United States in a way is we consume all these fantastic products from around the world without really thinking about that consumption at all. And it's kind of the nature of us being a wealthy superpower. It's a powerful country. We have a lot of money. It's fine. It's what we do. But what we do ends up having huge impact on people around the world. And sometimes that's good to know about. Now, and sometimes, when do we find out about these things? When something gets cut off or when it gets expensive or when, maybe there's a scandal or something. We pay a little bit of attention to it. But generally, we ignore everything about the supply chains that we deal with. I would say the same thing about iPhones. I was chatting with a group of students the other day. And I said, who has an iPhone? And everybody raised their hand. Everybody has an iPhone. And then the question is, do you know what goes into your iPhone? Nobody has any idea what goes into the iPhone. So it just seems to be kind of an interesting factor of modern life that we depend on these supply chains around the world that we fundamentally do not understand at all.
Yeah. So where does chocolate come from?
So chocolate, cacao is grown on a tree. I think that's kind of the starting point. It comes from a forest. People sort of forget that. It's legitimate to say cocoa beans are essentially, they're a nut inside a fruit. So, there's an old joke that chocolate is fruit or chocolate is salad or chocolate is a fruit or vegetable. It's kind of true. It depends on which chocolate you want to eat because it comes from a fantastic tree. Places like Peru and places like Uganda and Cote d'Ivoire and lots of places around the world have these trees, this fantastic forest. And not only is there a forest there are cocoa farmers, and so there are people out there that are managing these trees. And sometimes they do it in different ways, and as they do it in different ways, you get different flavors of cocoa. That's kind of one of the big oops that turns out not all chocolate tastes the same because different trees taste in a different way, like wine or coffee or something else you might want to think of that tastes different things. So cocoa comes from forest, then it gets processed, and it gets processed in different ways. And
Who processes it though?
well, it gets processed in a few different ways, and it depends on who the buyer is. Now, if you're going to make kind of your typical commercial chocolate, and we won't pick on any name brands per se, but the typical ones everybody finds in their supermarket, let's say, most of that cocoa comes from Cote d'Ivoire or Ghana, frankly, and then it goes to processors, typically in Europe, sometimes the US. They grind it all up. They mix it with a lot of milk and sugar, and they put it on the shelf. And that's kind of that process that they typically take. Other guys that are friends of mine, they process it in a different way. It goes into a box. It's usually processed in country. It's fermented, and then it's turned into specialty chocolate. And I have some samples here. One of my favorite brands, which I will hawk shamelessly. I have no, but I love these guys. Cacao Suyo, my friend Samir Gia, who's won so many awards for this chocolate. This happens to come from Peru. If you guys have heard of Machu Picchu, this is in Peru. There's a little bit of cacao in Cusco, some really good cacao actually in Cusco. But this guy sells this little package, which I got in Peru when I was there, and it has chocolate from 3 different places. Because guess what? Chocolate comes from different places. And what's fun about this is that the different bars actually come from different parts of Peru. So not only does the chocolate come from a country, Peru, which most people have no idea where the chocolate comes from at all. This comes from a country called Peru, and they put Machu Picchu on the box so you know where that is. And then they actually have Piura and Lacuna, a couple of different valleys where it comes from. So ironically, if you get into this, chocolate can be as sophisticated as wine or specific coffee flavors or other kinds of things. And this guy's been winning awards for his fantastic chocolate. The other thing that bothers me, of course, is chocolate has big award ceremonies, the International Chocolate Awards, and Cacao of Excellence and things like this. And yet people have no idea. It's sort of like, I was compared to, it's like you won the gold medal in skiing and there was no television coverage. No one showed up. It wasn't sponsored. It would be so sad to win a gold medal in skiing and no one knows. This happens to chocolate guys all the time.
Right. So you do hear more and more a little bit, if you're tuned in, about child labor in chocolate supply chains. But I think part of that you don't hear about is that there is low profitability at the producer level. And part of that has to do with the fact that farmers don't have small manufacturing right near where it's grown. So oftentimes it gets exported and they've never tasted chocolate in their life. So they have no idea what they're growing. Tell us a little bit about that and whether there's anything else what can we do about that? What's the solution?
So think about your favorite supermarket brand, and there's usually some gourmet guy with a white hat and talking about excellence and all these kinds of things. The magic in for those supermarket brands, let's just call them that for now, is all in the marketing. So they're not spending a lot on cocoa beans. They're not spending a lot on sugar. They're spending a hell of a lot on marketing and distribution and everything that gets that bar into the supermarket. But they're not actually spending a lot on the bar. That's kind of the sad thing. When you go buy a bar of chocolate at the supermarket, you're buying like 80% marketing and distribution and a little bit of the actual bar. So that's one thing to realize, is that that's kind of where the money is all in the marketing and in the distribution, not in the manufacturing of the bar, which is part of the sad news, because you're spending your money on essentially their ability to market back to you. You're subsidizing their ability to sell to you. That's really what you're subsidizing, not the bar, not the farmer, not the bean, not any of those kinds of things. Often the cocoa cost in a chocolate bar is less than 3 to 5%, less than 3 to 5%. And so you end up with these farmers, and this is an old story. And I have to say, there's a sad thing in chocolate. There's a connection to slavery that goes back to the very beginning. Cacao comes from Mexico originally. This is where Moctezuma and Cortez. Cortez is the first European to try chocolate. Columbus saw the beans but didn't know what they were. Cortez actually apparently tried chocolate. Anyway, it goes to Europe. The Europeans get excited about it. They actually start planting it around the world because they can't get enough out of Mexico. But in order to plant it, because it's hard, they end up using forced labor. So there's a lot of forced labor history in chocolate. It goes way back hundreds of years, and it's kind of always been associated. So there's this idea that really comes from, frankly, some of our supermarket brands that are a lot based in Europe, that the price of cacao needs to be kept cheap. We need to keep it cheap, and the way we keep that cheap is we'll buy it for whoever gives us the cheapest price. And if there's a little forced labor in there, well, that's okay, because we need to keep that price cheap. So they keep the price super cheap, and there's an open market for cacao trading, and it's traded at that open market. again, they don't really value well fermented cacao or special terroirs or special flavors. They just want the basic commodity as cheap as they can get it. And so the farmers, and this happens in West Africa, when it was planted, they didn't plant it, and there's a couple of different ways to plant cacao because it's a tree, right? So you can have a tree, and this is going to sound funny when this is going to sound really funny in a way. Cacao is a fruit, right? You have to
Yeah.
pollinate, right? You
Yeah.
have to pollinate it, right? Like bees pollinate, fruit trees.
Sure.
The funny thing, the way you pollinate a cacao flower is that there's a little midge. There's one, it's a tiny flower, and there's a little tiny midge is the only bug that can pollinate cacao. Well, that midge likes go ahead, Kristen, you're going to say something?
No, I was like, oh, I'm just surprised. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a little tiny fly, midge, it's called a midge, that pollinates cacao flowers. And that midge likes to live in a biodiverse forest.
Okay.
So ironically, if you only plant cacao, the midge has no place to live.
So,
And he's not happy. He doesn't have a house. And so you need some place for that little midge to live. And so this is when I was planting cacao in Peru. We would plant cacao around hardwoods and bananas and bushes and kind of this agroforest system. But the guys 40 years ago that planted cacao in Western Africa, they weren't thinking about the midges. They were just thinking, just plant the hell out of as much cacao as we can. So they monocropped it. They cut down anything in the path. And sadly, this means that every cacao tree doesn't produce enough. So we talk about productivity, and this is part of the cost problem. In Peru and other places, we were getting maybe a ton per hectare of cacao. In West Africa, it's typically 200 kilos per hectare, and that's because the midges have no place to live.
right. And then the community impact on that, right? So take it back. So those communities like basically have nothing else that they can grow because they have sacrificed the biodiversity in order to be able to.
Well, you monocrop this thing, and then it turns out when you only have one product and you have tons of hectares of it, okay? Well, you got to walk a long ways. It's hard work. You're sweating, and it's tremendous amount of labor. So the farmers themselves tend to be in their 50s and 60s, sometimes 70s. They tend to be older because this was all done a little while ago. Well, they don't want to do it all themselves. And so, well, guess what? They got, junior folks, little guys that either maybe sometimes they're relatives, sometimes they're imported from other countries, and you got 5, 6, 7, 8 year olds swinging machetes running around these forests because you don't have to pay them anything. You lock them in a shed, you don't pay them anything. Sometimes they give them little promises when they get started, and typically those kids will stay on that farm harvesting till they're strong enough to run away. That's really what limits them. When they're 16, 17 or whatever, and they're physically strong enough to run away, they just take off and leave the farm. And so then the farm is looking for another batch of kids. And it's sort of twisted to imagine that cacao consumption is matched to child labor. So in other words, 20 years ago when you and I met, the number of kids working in West Africa, as official estimates reported at that time, was maybe 1.2 million kids, something like that.
Wow, that's a lot.
Now,
It's a lot of
now
kids.
we're at 2 million kids.
Oh my gosh.
So as the world eats more chocolate, you need more kids.
Wow. Wow.
So as you and you think, wow, that's sort of awful. And what's the other irony about that, by the way, is that who typically buys cheap supermarket chocolate? It's kids. And those kids probably need better health choices or better diet nutritional choices. And so we also have a rise in child diabetes. So you can actually see kind of a
You're
class
exploiting kids at both ends.
on both ends. So whether you're producing cacao with kids or you're selling chocolate to kids, this is a little bit twisted in terms of a business. Now, I'll give you one of my favorite examples of this that, again, it'll blow your mind. Hopefully, your listeners don't yell at me and freak out on this, but it's sort of funny. Willy Wonka. We all know Willy Wonka. It's a fantastic story. Chocolate Factory, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Everybody loves it. I read it as a kid. It was a fun story. The Oompa Loompas that are central to the story, and they sing the songs and everything else. When the story was written, there were pygmy kids from Africa that had been shipped to London in crates. The whole story of Willy Wonka is essentially based on slave labor.
It's horrible. It's horrible when you like watch it with that lens and you see why some of these film producers have made it kind of menacing, but because it is.
Who are these people and where did they get there? And they don't get paid. And when Roald Dahl wrote the story, they don't have to pay him any money. He paid him like with bugs or something, and they don't eat anything, and they shipped them in crates. It literally said that. And this is in the day when you had slavery. There's this weird thing. If you ask people if they like slavery, typically most people say no. Slavery is horrible. They associate it with the 1800s. What they don't associate it with is 2 million kids today are swinging machetes running around, the forests of West Africa and other places, but typically West Africa is where it happens. Family labor, there's always an argument about family labor because in some places, again, Peru, Southeast Asia, other places, you do have family farms and kids are involved. But here's really the question always is that kid going to school? So there's always that question. Is the kid part of a family farm? He is going to school. Yeah, he's working a couple hours after work. That's part of that family farm dynamic. Or is this a child that's never seen a school that spends 12 hours a day swinging a machete and the only break he ever gets is when he's big enough to run off that farm? And that's kind of, so we have to be sort of careful what we mean by that because there's sort of reasonable healthy family labor that could happen within
Sure.
small holding farming, and that's got to
Sure.
differentiate that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, sometimes, yeah. I mean, here in Michigan, it's often considered normal for families to work on the farm together,
They work
right?
on it
Starting
together.
at a very young age. And we're not saying that that's what this is. We're
No.
saying this is something very different when you import or traffic, you're trafficking children into slavery in order to be able to produce more of something. And part of that has to do with what we've said before, like the farmer is not getting paid much, right? They're not getting, if they were paid more, if they actually had a stake in the profitability of what it was that they were producing, it might be different. The quality might be different. The way that they do labor might be different. If they had a share, profitability was at the end market, and they don't have that. They don't taste their chocolate. They don't know what it gets used for. It's completely exploitive.
Why pay more? Because this is something that companies are allergic to. They're not going to voluntarily offer more money for something. So part of the challenge there is how you change the game of chocolate,
Yeah. So
right?
how do you?
Well, so part of it is, and this is kind of an interesting question. So let me ask you this: when you buy wine, maybe you buy wine now and then.
Sure.
Somebody sold you generic wine in a box and just said, "This is wine." And it didn't say where it was from and it didn't say anything about it. It just said red wine in a box.
$2 Chuck.
$2 chuck. You might exactly right. Now, now let's say that then someone else sold you another bottle of wine that was $10 a bottle or $20 a bottle, and they said it came from a valley or it came from a place or they told you something about the wine. Would it bother you to pay $10 or $15 for that other wine versus the $2 wine?
Not at all, because also I know I'm not going to get hung over. I know what I'm consuming. It tastes better. It's more of an experience than the cheap stuff is.
So this is kind of the thought, and this is what happened in coffee. So years ago, everybody drank, Maxwell House or Nescafe. That's all there was, a cup of Joe, and that's all anybody ever knew. And then somewhere along the line, Starbucks popped up, or Pete's Coffee, or Specialty Coffee came along, and everyone started thinking about, but where's my coffee from? Well, then there was Colombian, and it was Mountain Grown, and all of a sudden, Colombia was a brand, and Juan Valdez was a thing. And then you go to Starbucks, and now they're going to say, oh, this coffee comes from Uganda. Now, some people don't buy it still. I've still had friends that say it all tastes the same. It's just coffee. It's just black stuff. There's no difference. But thankfully, probably half the market now thinks there
Hmm.
is a difference, right?
Yeah.
So there is a difference between the crappy stuff or the basic stuff, cup of Joe, whatever you want to call it, versus maybe fancy. And people even now think of Starbucks as a commodity coffee. They don't even think it necessarily is very fancy. And now there's a bunch of other fancy coffee. So is this your experience of coffee?
Yeah, I mean, I don't drink coffee,
Oh, yeah.
but yes.
Yeah, yeah. So this is the idea: is how do you? So the question for chocolate is, how can we sort of change that experience so that people start to ask themselves the question, "Hey, where's this chocolate from?" Simple
Right.
question. Do I know where
Yeah.
it comes from? If I knew where it comes from, oh, and there's an idea of different tastes, because I'll tell you what would happen. If the average consumer questioned where the chocolate came from and they realized it all came from Ivory Coast and it all came from Ghana, there would be an immediate change in consumption. And this is kind of the short version. So the way we change the pricing model is essentially to bring some diversity to the offering. And so this is why like friends like Cacao Suyu and others are out there marketing, is to try to say, look, instead of buying that simple supermarket chocolate, maybe you could buy something else that comes from a different place that says where it comes from. And that now so the short version is consumer behavior. I think that the best way to change the market is to help educate the consumer. Now, educating the consumer is expensive, it's hard, it's slow. It wasn't easy in coffee. It's not easy in a lot of commodities to educate the consumer a little bit. But that's part of the question, is to educate the consumer. So the consumers demand more, they demand different flavors, they demand to know a little bit what's going on. So that's one approach, just one.
Yeah. So I think what you're saying makes sense, right? The more educated you become about what you're consuming and the more you've tasted something that's good, you want something that's good, right? And, you see coffee, as you point out, like when you go to the grocery store, when I was growing up, there was, you know,
Folgers.
one little
Right, right,
part of one little shelf, and now it's a whole row of different options
right.
of coffee. Now that I can go and get really fancy coffee at Kroger's or the, local grocery store, it's easy. How can I get good chocolate?
Well, that's a fair question. I think online you can find it, but you have to know what you're looking for. There's a few stores that'll sell it. Maybe just the distribution issue is we need more demand. Now, I have to mention one favorite example. Can we get Leonardo DiCaprio on your podcast? Maybe
I don't know about that.
we need to get Leonardo. Leonardo did something in the diamond business that changed the diamond business. He made this movie called Blood Diamond.
Yeah.
And ironically, that movie changed the diamond business. That one movie did. And it was sort of impressive because there's a process now which people throw rocks at and it's got issues, called the Kimberly process, but it was essentially motivated by that one movie. So this is what's interesting, is that to some degree when you're educating, it's not just educating the consumer, it's somewhat inspiring the consumer. This is not to bring up, Uncle Tom's Cabin as a book changed the United States view on slavery. People read that book and they got offended by it. They were like, what's going on here? Blood Diamond changed how people's view some of the Stones things. In chocolate, I'll just say this from that education point of view, people have made documentaries, and I'm writing a book on this, and we want to do a movie. And I think this is where we want to go. Is I essentially think we need to create a little bit the Blood Diamond version of chocolate. And the reason I mention that is that the documentaries are out there, and people have talked about these kinds of things, and yet it hasn't inspired change. It hasn't inspired people to really
Right.
get excited about this.
Because it's still not easy. Like I want to do the right thing. Generally, and I think I'm not alone, right? I think most people want to do the right thing, but people also want things that taste good. You know, generally, I mean, this is why you have so many people who are willing to go out to buy the right kind of wine, the right kind of olive oil, the right kind of, different things. Honey, I think, is another thing that people don't realize what diversity there is based
Yeah,
on, the bees and like the biodiversity of where it's cultivated and blah, blah, blah. But, anyways, I think people want to do the right things, but it's got to be easy.
got to be
Things
easy.
have to be easy. And with that, right? So, even through our conversations, through work that we've both done in countries around the world, I still have my iPhone. I know what goes into it. So, talk a little bit about iPhones, what goes into it in your work now.
So we've set up a company called Verticore, and the idea of Verticore is to deal with supply chain issues just in mining across the board, just because it's a massive problem. It's ironic that there's probably 30,000 kids in DRC, mining cobalt, and that cobalt probably ends up in the technology we all use. And again, it's just not well known. So it's kind of a similar issue to chocolate. It's almost the same issue as how do you kind of get that well known. Now, let me just say back to your distribution issue. There's the simplest version is simply being conscious. There are efforts to create new phones. There's something called the fair phone, fair smartphone or something. They just didn't have much market play. You've got Apple out there pushing hard. Apple sells a lot of apples. So whenever you're trying to change a supply chain, it's a combination of consumer awareness, and I won't use the word shame, but I think you have to sort of help the big boys realize that change is ultimately in their favor, that there's an advantage to this, that the costs of not changing are higher than the cost of changing. Now, sometimes that's lawsuits. There have been lawsuits. There have been lawsuits both in cacao and in supply chains. There's a number that are running right now. Sometimes it's bad press. Bad press is kind of the biggest one. If they can't beat it with public relations. There's the stories and those kinds of things. Ultimately, what I want to say with Verticore, though, is what we want to get to is that when you don't have good relationships with stakeholders, and we'll include those kids and their families and the community stakeholders, there's a liability for them to shut you down. Sometimes they get mad.
Yeah.
Sometimes they get machetes going and they block your trucks, and sometimes and the trucks don't move. And so then we have something called license to operate. When they block you, you've essentially lost your social license to operate, is the concept that's been talked about. I look at this a little bit like Charles Deming and the defect process that led to TQM back in Japan, back in the 80s when the Japanese cars came. This is a day when Detroit rejected Deming and his statistical model to prevent defects. What he said, he took it to the Japanese and said, let's prevent defects from happening. Let's track them statistically. Let's produce better cars. And that's why, many people drive Toyotas these days because of what Deming did. So part of this is to see actually that relationship with stakeholders, including the child laborers and others, as something that we can prevent. Let's figure out how to sense it. Let's figure out how to prevent it. And then let's track that and make that part of our financing scheme and part of our marketing scheme.
Yep.
Because ultimately it's going to be cheaper to prevent it and cheaper to manage it for the company. So this is kind of the economic argument we're making as a company, saying, ultimately you're going to make more money if you prevent this than if you're always having to react, if you're always trying to cover things and these kinds of things. And so we worked in mining, we're looking at energy, we're looking at big infrastructure, and we're also looking at cacao and chocolate. So this is the idea to say, and I would call this enlightened self-interest. If you take care of the stakeholders, we call this stakeholder prosperity assurance. We've been publishing on this lately. And the idea is that the people around your investment need to prosper.
Yeah.
If you think you're going to invest in some big factory or a mine or energy or even an AI server farm, and everyone around you is going to be in abject poverty, maybe that's not going to work forever. Maybe, and it's not the matter that you care. You don't have to be humanitarian. We're not asking you to be committed to philanthropy necessarily. It's just to realize that when the folks with the pitchforks and the machetes get mad, eventually they're going to interrupt you. And you can't just shoot them all. That's not the approach.
Well, and I mean, just to bring this issue sort of to the US, because I think a lot of the people who are listening to this are probably saying in the US and they're going, yeah, but aren't these jobs for people, right? I mean, aren't they at least jobs? They're getting paid something.
Sure.
Because our perception is that, everybody works for nothing overseas or barely anything. So everyone's used to being exploited. But just to bring it here, I mean, it happens here all the time. You have a mill town where the mill goes away, and that is what the prosperity was, and it becomes a ghost town. I mean, I drive up north and I go through these towns all the time where there's a few people out, but like the vacancy rates, the commercial vacancy rates are huge because what was once there, the supply chain, the manufacturing chain, whatever it was, no longer exists, and everybody left. So this is an issue no matter where you are in the world, and that you need to have some kind of communication between the community where you're working, the workers who are doing it, and the company, any big company who's there, and you have to have diversity. You can't have a community relying on one
Right.
industry.
This is the funny thing about mining in particular, and I have to say this, all the ski towns in Utah and Colorado, every one of them started as a mine. Bizarrely. And in fact, I have a very close family member, I won't say who for her sake, but she lives in a housing complex that's built on the tailings area of a copper mine in Salt Lake City. So it turns out that copper mine, which is like 100 years old, had dumped a bunch of tailings all over the west part of Salt Lake City. And they got sued, and as they dealt with the lawsuits, they ended up building a housing complex that has since won awards. and it's actually where a family member now owns a house. So it's sort of funny how these things happen because, yeah, you start off with a mine or a cacao project. The question is, all those are what we call corridors, economic corridors. And that whole economic corridor needs to develop, and there could be a number of businesses that kind of come out of that. There's always service businesses. Everybody needs mechanic shops and beauty salons and postal
Sure.
services and other kinds of things. Those all come out of that. Transport, logistics, banking,
Yep.
etc.
Yep.
But then
Yep.
you have these sort of economic drivers. And in some ways, when you think about these supply chains, you're looking at the cities of tomorrow.
Yeah.
There's many ways where that mine goes, or where even the cacao supply chain, or wherever that goes, if potentially gets developed. You get jobs, you get energy, you get roads, you get water, you get all the services you need. And I don't know if you guys like playing Sim City or not, but in some ways you're creating sort of the cities of the future to
Yeah.
say, where these supply chains happen, that's kind of where economic activity is going to happen for the next 100 years. And ideally, as you said, if it's done well and it's done wisely, they don't become ghost towns because they diversify their economy and they kind of realize they need to move beyond the one economic anchor and develop a few others. So that's kind of where that, and of course it happens in the United States. It's sort of unbelievable. It happens all over the United States. So many ghost towns, and it's happened well. I mean, Park City starts as a mining town. And Vale starts as a mining town, and all these towns are a mining town. And what did they diversify into? Skiing. So they started off as a mining town, and then and in fact, it's funny, some of those early ski lifts were just mining equipment that was repurposed for skiing. I mean, it just went over.
Well, and this is where I would argue you need designers or creatives, right? Somebody who can come in and look at your situation and say, this is what else we could do. This is how we could design it in order for something better, something diverse, something else to happen. Or, here is how creatives can add to that supply chain, right? There's packaging and there's small artisans, there's small manufacturing for cacao. Or you could go in and you could develop cacao or chocolate tourism, and you could have small manufacturing, you could have specialty foods, and these are things that people can do in their house. These are people that these are things that anybody can do.
Yeah, yeah.
But sometimes you need somebody to go in and say, okay, let's take a look at the resources you have available. Let's see, what else can we do?
So you,
Skiing, you
well,
know?
I'm eating chocolate that won the best chocolate in the world last year
How
from
is it?
Cacao Suyo. It's fantastic. It comes from El Ganso. This is Cacao Suyo. It won regional, national, and global international chocolate awards. By the way, you said, can you buy it? Of course, you can buy it. My favorite place to buy chocolate in the States is in Salt Lake City. Caputo's is a delicatessen, has the best chocolate selection I've ever seen, and they have an online store, and you can
It's
buy
so
it.
good. Yeah, you've sent me there before. Caputo's is,
They're
yeah.
really good. So there are ways of doing it, but in terms of the creatives, there's two sides of the creative story that I think that maybe just highlight. We talked about educating the consumer. So Blood Diamond. If you're going to make more movies like Blood Diamond, obviously it's a creative process. You're making a movie. And if the movie's a good movie and it's a compelling movie and you got good actors and it needs to be a good movie, by the way, documentaries don't sell. It's sort of funny. There's been many documentaries in chocolate that have not moved the needle. It's really that creative fictional story that gets people excited, that gets people inspired. And that's true throughout history. You tell a good story and you change the market. So that was kind of the one area I think about in terms of creatives. But then the other area you just jumped to is the creative development area where you've got to be able to look at like something boring like a mining supply chain or a cacao farm and say what else can we do here, and that creative part on the development side, and say so there's creatives on both ends in a
Yeah.
sense. You got to create on the kind of that consumer side, but then absolutely create on the consumer. Sometimes they go together. Now I'll give you a terrible example. It's not true, but everyone knows about the Keebler elves, right?
Yeah.
Little guys.
Yeah, I loved the Keebler Elves when I was little. We
They're
would,
making cookies
yeah,
in the ovens, right?
yeah,
In my mind's eye, someone would make a version of the Keebler elves for cacao and chocolate that would be somewhat related to reality. You'd have healthy farmers in their families producing cacao, and they would become the new chocolate elves
I
that
like
are
that.
actually producing chocolate that people could relate to. Because that whole story of the Keebler elves, that was kind of to give, some sense of coolness and kind of funness to this cookie. It's a cookie that's made in a big factory, but how do you kind of relate to it? Well, it's these elves. And so these stories, these brand awareness, a lot of that stuff was created in Madison
I
Avenue
like
in
that.
the 60s. But how do we create kind of that, the forest of chocolate? And, think about it. It needs to get into the arts, absolutely, on the television and in terms of movies, in terms of creativity. I'm writing a book on this. I've told you a little bit about it. My book is trying to link, in a creative, fictional way, people that are in the West to kind of what's going on in West Africa in a way that they can relate to, and realize there's a little bit of a dark side of this. I will just mention this. I'm calling the genre chocolate noir.
I love it. Tell me what it
Why?
means.
Chocolate noir, because everyone knows, if you know, noir is French for black and dark. So people talk about dark chocolate, and sometimes you see it on package that says chocolate noir if you're in Europe. But the idea is, everyone knows that film noir. Noir is these tough movies like Chinatown and the Maltese Falcon and some of these old movies, black and white sometimes, where it talked about a tough reality, right? And I think that's appropriate for chocolate in a way, because the reality is tough. You can't talk about child slavery that's ongoing. That's going to probably grow. I mean, if there's 2 million kids in chocolate slavery today, there'll probably be 3 million in 10 years. I mean, it's not going anywhere because the consumption of chocolate's going up. So to some degree, how do
Unless
you
it
talk about,
changes, right?
unless something dramatic, unless there's a Blood Diamond movie, or something really changes, it's not gonna go anywhere.
Well, and then here's the thing that I think that people need to hear, because they say, okay, all right, it's all bleak and there's no solutions. There are solutions, right? Like Barry Callebaut, biggest producer of chocolate, for example, in order to meet their ESG, environmental, social, and governance standards, they started working with the Mexican farmers that they were buying sugar from. And they started to provide them with safety equipment. They started to provide them with bonuses if they did certain environmentally friendly practices. They started to incentivize, like, working with women suppliers, working, other things in order to be able to meet the metrics for their stakeholders. If stakeholders demand it, there are solutions, right? I mean, there is equipment that can go into those mines in the Congo. There is protective equipment that wouldn't provide, I mean, these people are being decimated, families, communities with cancer, with all kinds of things. They could be protected. There is equipment. There is ways to do it. It's just that the companies are choosing not to.
Well, there's
Am I
two.
wrong?
No, there's two ways that companies take action. There's two levers. Sometimes people forget this. How do you get a company to change? There's two levers. One is the consumer lever. When the consumer gets mad about something, you remember Nike and the kids making footballs in Pakistan, they had to kind of respond quickly. Nestle got beat up over milkmaids a lot of years ago, and so they're still suffering with that a little bit, and so there is that consumer scandal response, and that's kind of a big lever. So to some degree, people are involved with that. A friend of mine, Ann Riggs, runs a website called Slavery Free Chocolate, and she just makes a list of all the chocolate that has no slavery in it. So there's some of that kind of thing. So that's kind of, you can get involved in the consumer side. In terms of the actual solutions on the ground, there's many solutions, and I have to throw a little kudos out to a big YouTube competitor of yours. Let's call him that. Is this guy named Mr. Beast? So this guy, Mr.
Yeah,
Beast, God bless
he's
his
good.
heart, he was kind of crazy. He has all the crazy videos and all the cash. He actually has talked about the issue of child labor and announced, that he wants to do something with Rockefeller Foundation. Now, when it says do something about it, there are practical solutions. There's no question there's practical solutions. I'll give you my favorite one. You want to hear my favorite
Yeah,
solution for child
let's hear
labor?
it.
It's the simplest, dumbest thing you can imagine. School lunches.
Okay.
And why?
Yeah.
The reason that families let their kids go work on farms is they don't have enough food to feed them. Often is what happens. So when the farmer is providing enough food to keep the kid alive, mom lets the kid go, and you get kids from Burkina Faso that get on buses and end up farms in places like Ivory Coast and so forth. Well, if and this is a funny thing, this is the magical thing, and this was done in the States in the 50s and 60s, and it actually had a good impact. when you provide school lunches in these environments, which is not that expensive, $10 a day, piece of cake, anybody could do it. That was wealthy. I'm not a billionaire yet, but we'll get there. If the lunch is at the school, well, then the kid wants to go to the school because there's lunch, and mom wants the kid to go to school because at least he's eating. And once you got the kid at the school, well, then he's in the school. He's not on the farm. And then when he's on the when he's in the school, well, then you can work on curriculum development, and maybe he could be an agronomist. Maybe he can learn a bunch of things. Maybe he ends up in the farm after school. But if lunch is being served at the school, he's going to the school because he wants the lunch.
Yep.
Straight that.
Yep.
So what you've done is you've now created a new incentive for that kid to say, I'm not going to the farm. And mom says, I don't have to go to the farm. Why? Because there's school lunch. So school lunch is the cheapest, easiest way to create a new incentive for that whole family as a beginning point. Just start with that. School lunch. There's actually some good NGOs that do this kind of work. Raise Meals is out there that does some of this kind of thing. Not tied to cocoa farming per se, but they do lunch programs. And so this is the simplest thing. So that if moms, and then you end up with curriculum development, and the school lunch, by the way, creates a bit of a demand for agriculture products. So you have a little bit of a supply chain that comes out of that.
Absolutely.
So
yep.
subsidized school lunches is one of those things that I actually think is a pretty good idea. Practical solution.
Yeah.
That's number one. The number two thing is, and this is the regulatory question, if it was up to me, every chocolate bar in the world, and there was a bill in Congress, believe it or not. So the Harkins-Engels bill was to put slavery-free chocolate label on every chocolate product in America, and it got beat by the chocolate industry that said they raised a bunch of money, they were going to fix the issue, whatever. The second thing is, this is a regulatory fix, is if we required origin on every chocolate bar, it would sort of fix the problem. If you had to put on and this is a regulatory issue, so people like getting involved in regulatory legal kinds of issues, just ask your congressman, you know what, we don't want all this slavery chocolate coming in, let's just have people label where it comes from. If every chocolate bar said made in Cote d'Ivoire or made wherever it was made, people would immediately start asking the questions of what's going on there, or why is it being made there, and what's going on there. So this is one of those things, if we just required that would change it. Absolutely change it. Barry Callebaut would have to respond. The thing that's a little tricky, and I have to say this, and we'll see if Barry listens to this. Barry is both a perpetrator of some of the worst ills and some of the solutions.
Yeah.
And this is.
I did not mean to give them a clean slate.
This is kind of the strange thing, right? Is you get, and then there's several versions of layers in this industry, so it's hard to pin anybody down. Where are all these kids? I don't know. I didn't know these kids. Everybody signed my document.
But I think it's also just to say the example that I gave with what Barry Callebaut is doing is that they had an incentive to do it. The IFC, the International Finance Corporation, said, we will subsidize this. If you do this in your supply chain, we are going to provide you with certain benefits in order for you to do that. So I don't think companies are rational beings who have a purpose, which is to make profits. And I know, you are very much interested in how do companies benefit, because when companies benefit, they do the right thing. You have to be able to benefit from doing the right thing, but you also have to be able to see the future. You have to be able to look to what the benefit is in the future, not just today.
Totally agreed. And frankly, what you're pointing at is the other lever is the bankers. When the bankers tell the companies what to do, and that's where you get your ESG and your compliance and everything else. Hey, if you want a loan, then you're going to have to comply with some rules. And so this is the other point, is the bankers. So the bankers and the finance guys. So the two levers that influence a company are what the consumers say and what the bankers say. And in the case of ESG, it's essentially a banker-driven process where the bankers decide, often European bankers. Ironically, the Europeans had some fantastic sourcing requirements that were going to go into effect in a couple of months ago, and they just relaxed them. And they relaxed them as geopolitics is changing, and it's sort of sad because everyone was ramping up to them, and then they relaxed them. So this is the regulatory side. So there's obviously regulation does matter. That's a lever. It's just hard to move, and it's slow.
Yeah.
The bankers are a lever, and that's a big one because people need to borrow money, and that has a big impact. And then consumers. My favorite one, and I think about people that might listen to you and our listeners, my favorite one is consumers because that's the easiest one to touch and feel. But as you know, it's also hard to control. Consumers do what they do. They get excited about TikTok videos. They get excited about all kinds of things. You never know what's going to go viral and, whatever. So this is kind of the question of where would you rather push on these issues, which and then your own personal consumption. So, for example, in my family, we don't like to buy things that come out of certain countries because of the slave labor problem, and we just make that as a choice. And when people ask us about it, we tell them we don't like to buy those kinds of things because there's a child labor issue there, or there's some kind of slave labor issue there, and we talk about slavery. So, I think what an average person can do is, one, you can decide where you buy stuff and how you buy stuff and the questions you ask. And I think that simple purchase price issue is probably the most effective. If every one of your listeners made purchases that avoided slavery, simply that, you would influence millions of markets if we could get that replicated. And then there's what the bankers do, and then there's what happens at kind of the regulatory level. So you have those three big levers. You want to hit the regulatory lever, the banking lever, or the consumer lever. All three of those will have a big impact on the companies. And then I guess my favorite one is, do you get rid of the bad stuff or do you promote the good stuff?
And you and I sit on different sides of that sometimes.
And that's fine because you need both. It's a bit of
because you do need both, right?
Carrot and stick, right? There is kind of some naming and shaming going on with the bad stuff, and that's fair, and that happens. And then but what's the alternative, as you pointed out? And there is actually, and I'll plug them, and I have no financial interest, but Caputo's is fantastic, and they're online, Caputo's Markets, and they have the most incredible selection of specialty chocolate. Almost in every town, there's some little shop
there is
that has the great chocolate. You got to go out of your way. It's not at the supermarket. You got to do a little education to get there. And again, that's the failure, I think, of the marketing and the consumer story, that it's not more widely available. I mean, just reality.
Well, and there are some great chocolate bloggers that are out there that we can point people to and things like that as well. Two other things I want to just bring up really quick. One is we did trade shows together. It was your idea. You have to bring Afghans outside of the country. Nobody wakes up and says, let's go see what we can buy in Afghanistan. It just doesn't happen because our perception from media is that it's war-torn, it's a horrible place. The problem is that China doesn't see it that way. Russia doesn't see it that way. So there are a lot of business opportunities there. And so when you were working for the U.S. government, you said, let's bring Afghans outside of Afghanistan and make it easy for people to meet them and see their products. One of the things, I mean, there's lots. We could do a whole nother podcast on the trade shows. And I've thought about doing a whole series of different, because it would be fun, because it was quite the experience. But one of the things I will say is that, saffron, this is what struck me the most. Afghanistan is the biggest producer, is that the biggest producer in the world of saffron. One of the only places in the world you can get saffron. Very expensive to purchase. And if I was in Kazakhstan, I could get saffron in a beautiful, beautiful container. But at the trade shows, they were coming in these chintzy, clear containers. And yes, those were the ones that were packaged inside of Afghanistan. The profits were all going to Afghans. But what if they had creatives? What if they had product designers? What if they had packaging designers to be able to help them manufacture and distribute in different ways? It would add value, correct?
So creatives should never underestimate their power. Not in a million years. Absolutely no question. Perceived value is magic. I had a friend that worked in the furniture business, and he said he could sell the same chair for $50, $500, or $5,000, depending on how he marketed it, because people don't understand how things are valued, and creatives are all about this. And so it's all about the illusion. So is that amazing saffron or some weird red stuff that fell out of somebody's pocket, somewhere? Well, that depends completely on the packaging, 100% on the packaging. When I used to be a food broker back in the days, as you know, before USAID,
Yeah.
we used to talk about the power of packaging. How do you know a bottle of vodka is vodka versus a bottle of vinegar, or white vinegar? All about the packaging. It's the same clear liquid. You don't know if that's water, vodka, or whatever it is. It could be bleach for all you know. And it's completely based on the packaging. So packaging is absolutely crucial in all of this. Packaging, distribution, marketing, promotion of the 5 Ps. You guys remember product, price, all those kinds of things. The thing about those trade shows, the thing I found interesting is that people get angry about geopolitics and they have different opinions about it. But then they love something.
They love it.
Emeralds from Afghanistan. The rubies. I want those. I've been to Switzerland and I've seen a guy encrusting rubies on a watch. It was a $300,000 watch. He didn't know they came from Afghanistan. He didn't care. Somebody's buying a 300,000. It's worth a house. And they're buying a watch. And it's got rubies encrusted from Afghanistan. He doesn't give a flip where those rubies came from, but he loves the rubies. The reason trade keeps happening is places like Afghanistan have stuff. And they have amazing stuff that people want. And they don't care if there's a war or who gets abused or what the process is. They just want that stuff because ultimately we like to consume things. So this is really the question is as that consumption drive, pushes the world around, how do you sort of work around that drive for consumption and say, okay, let's see what we can do with that consumption so that it's not promoting a war or slavery or abuse in some ways. But we're not going to stop the consumption. It's as old as humans are. We like to consume stuff, and we like to consume stuff from all over. So that was really the point of the trade shows in some ways, was to say, Afghanistan, despite all the news you've heard, has some great stuff, like saffron and like rubies and like carpets and a bunch of amazing things. So how do we change that image?
And come and meet them. Come and meet them in person. Because
right.
These are wonderful, warm, kind people with rich cultural history who are passionate about the products, the rugs that they're weaving by hand, that, you can come and just meet them and talk with them.
It's something I love so much about trade. You and I may not vote for the same people. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. I don't know, politics, whatever. But we can agree that this great chocolate from Peru is fantastic. And we can agree that the rugs are amazing. And we can agree on all these products. And that's why I sort of love the trade focus for things. And so even when our current political leadership, and I don't want to throw too many rocks, are kind of changing the globe in terms of trade, what's ironic about that, to me, America first. And yet, we need stuff from other places. It turns out almost immediately, oh yeah.
Right.
And we need the chocolate, and we need the batteries, and we need the spices. And it turns out we can be as America first as we want about it, and yet we don't have everything in the borders of the United States that we need. So then we need stuff from somewhere else. So we're going to have to trade for that at some point.
Right.
And we're going to need to know if that trade is stable, if it works, if we can keep getting the stuff. At some point, some trade, sadly, can be stable but abusive. And this is where I put the slavery. It's stable, but it's abusive. Some trade is not stable. In other words, it comes and goes. You're not sure you're going to get it. It's an unstable trade. So everybody needs trade. There's one thing that's very attractive that always used to drive me nuts is self-sufficiency. We're going to make our own stuff. We're going to grow our own stuff. We're going to buy our own stuff. And we're going to live in our own borders. It never works.
I mean, I'm family first, and I'm not able to do everything myself for my family by any means.
Adam Smith, Ricardo, it's just the reality of life is we're trading. We've been trading for thousands of years, no matter what anybody says. In the middle of the most communist country in the world, people are trading. It's sort of one of the things that sort of happens no matter where you go. You don't have to believe in trade for it to happen. It happens in prisons. It happens.
It's never not happened. Let's put it that way. It's never not happened.
It just happens. It's people trade stuff. They need stuff. They have stuff. They're trading stuff. It's the most human thing that we do. I mean,
and the thing is it breeds social connection, right? I mean, those kinds of things. And then you learn a little bit more. So it's not just like you're trading stuff. You're trading ideas. You're trading cultures. You're learning from other people through those transactions. And that's important because we need that. We're built for a social connection.
I have a little factoid. I have a few they're Lorenisms, just things that I've learned over life. Maybe I'll write a book someday. Maybe I won't on these, but I'll give you one. You can never unmeet someone.
Right.
You meet them, it's a one-way
in a good way or a bad way, right?
Either way.
You
might forget about them later, but you met them. And that was always the thing about trade shows is we were creating connections. People were meeting each other. And no matter what happens with politics, they still met. Now, maybe they remembered the phone number. Maybe they kept in contact. Maybe they didn't, but they met. And that's kind of that one-way street that I think we need to meet each other more. We need to meet people around the world. And whether it works out well or whether it doesn't, those connections matter. They absolutely matter.
And I think that goes back to your power of perception. And on that, talk to me about the woman with green eyes who is behind you and how that changed perceptions of Afghanistan and what impact that had.
So this woman, this photo, this was painted by a local artist in Afghanistan. I bought it at the local market there, but that's a photo of the most famous National Geographic photo, the girl with the green eyes, which was a picture that was taken back during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Photographer took it. He ran away. It was a famous. The striking green eyes were so powerful it got into a lot of people's imagination, and it is the number one most popular photo in National Geographic history. The story goes that photographer later on, out of guilt, I think, went on and found this person. Her name was Sharbat Gul, and she lives in Afghanistan. And she had a tough life. She didn't have an easy life. She spent time in Afghanistan. She spent time in Pakistan. We met her, and I will share this a little bit. This is kind of a funny visual later. Thanks for asking for that. We actually had a trade show for her, Sharbat
Wow.
Gul, where we launched a line of carpets in her honor.
Very
And,
cool.
and the benefits of those carpets went to her, support her. She's an amazing woman. She's a strong woman. I think she's in Italy now. When the Taliban took over, she fled there. But these are real people. So there's a product, and I have to say, National Geographic sold a lot of magazines off of her image.
Right? And it connected. Like I would say that in the US when people thought about Afghanistan, that was a picture that was in our mind because it did. The news picked it up. It was in the media on a regular basis. And because it's very striking and it just goes to show like it breeds connection, right? I mean, even that and it art, photography, it changes the way that we see people and the way that we connect.
Kind of the blood diamond moment of Afghanistan in a way. It was her. People cared, and so yeah, we haven't had that moment yet in chocolate, I think. And I guess that's a question for mine: is you, me, or some of our hopefully listeners will create the blood diamond of chocolate and create this revolution so that everybody thinks about it, and iPhones and the other supply chains that sort of impact all of us, and say, you know what, we do care. We not only want that stuff, but we want the people involved in that stuff to not have terrible lives and to actually be benefiting from those things. And we want to know that they're okay, that they're really Keebler elves back there that are sort of producing these things in a healthy, happy way in some forest instead of some sort of awful abusive situation that we don't even want to pay attention to. So that's the vision.
And just one last thing. When you talk about this, when you talk about what your company's doing, right? You're not suggesting that you're trying to push companies to do something that's not in their self-interest. You're suggesting that better conversations leads to better problem solving and that there can be winners for everybody. Am I
Yeah.
oversimplifying?
My one of my favorite phrases is enlightened self-interest. Enlightened self-interest. I care about the neighbors, not because I only care about the neighbors. Maybe I can have a little charity for the neighbors, but that's not the only reason. If I care about the neighbors and how the neighbors are doing, my neighborhood gets better. Do I want to live in a house where I've got razor wire and guns on the wires? That's not great. Who wants to live there? Do I want to live in a neighborhood where people are going to jump through my windows all the time because they're having a terrible life? That's not great. So enlightened self-interest says, I want to do well, and probably it's in my interest for my neighbors and colleagues and contacts to do better too. It's not a zero-sum game, and it's not that I make money, they lose money, or they make money and I lose money. There's more money to be made. People must understand how value creation happens. I can make more money, they can make more money, we can make more money together. It's not a win-lose kind of situation. It is only is if I pay attention. But yeah, this is kind of the idea that you don't win and everyone else loses. That's not a reality. If they lose, you lose too at the end of the day. So enlightened self-interest says you want to win and you want those that you're working with to win as well. That's what I call prosperity.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Lauren, for coming and being a board member, being a big champion of Be Global by Design from the very beginning. It's great to have you on the show, and it's great to talk to you. And we could probably keep going. We'll call it an end for now. Until next time.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Appreciate your leadership. I think it's a fantastic initiative and I wish you all the best.